Hi, welcome to this video on the 10 PC building mistakes that could completely ruin your build. At least it probably won't turn on the first time you push the button. Most of these are fixable. I'm going to do them in the order of severity, but some of them may cause permanent damage to one or more of the components in the system. So let me go through them. Number one, pretty straightforward, not reading the manual. Now maybe I go a little overboard. I tend to read manuals almost cover to cover. I skip some of the safety and other warning type material at the beginning, and I don't go through the follow chapters at the end that are irrelevant to what I'm trying to do. But the meat of it, for example, on a motherboard manual, which is what I'm referring to here, you want to read the center sections of it. Let me give you an example. Now, going through the manual that came with your motherboard is absolutely critical for a successful PC build. There are things in here you have to familiarize yourself with. In particular, this one has a critical connector here. They call it the JFP1 for this particular manufactured motherboard, but it shows you where all of the front panel connectors have to go to in order for the case to be able to control the motherboard, power on, power off, and the various lights that you have. Okay, mistake number two, putting memory or buying memory for the system that is just too big for that particular system that you've gotten the parts for. The biggest problem usually is the actual cooler, especially if you have an air cooler as opposed to a water cooler. The height of the RAM is very critical. Let me show you an example here. This one here on the screen has a height of nearly twice that of most of the RAM that you find out there. I mean, obviously it looks nice, has a nice flare to it, looks like a wing almost, and it does ARGB. Is that worthwhile if you have to send it back because your cooler bumps into it? Or if you put it into a very small case, you could run into the same problem. Mistake number three, getting the little pins on an I/O shield stuck inside the various I/O connectors. Now, this really only applies to a motherboard where the shield is not already part of the motherboard. Most of the expensive ones that you get, even some of the moderate to moderate high ones, will have it embedded into one piece. But still, a lot of brand new motherboards out there, in order to save cost, they use the standard I/O shield that you have to push into that little tight spot in the case. And anybody who's done that knows it takes a while. And when they're trying to get the motherboard in, well, let me give you an example here. If you look very carefully at the back of an I/O shield, you see these little fingers. Certain ones can actually get in the way of some of the I/O connectors. For example, this one right here that has two little fingers pointed down in towards it. If those get bent when you're trying to install the motherboard and they go into the connector, then you could get a short. You'd have to pull the motherboard back out again, and sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge if you've already screwed it down quite a bit. See how this tab here is sort of sticking out a little bit? I've actually had that one get into that connector. The I/O shield needs to be carefully placed. Now, it's hard to do when you're trying to wiggle it into the cabinet, but you have to carefully place it so that none of those pins, as you can see right there, this one here, started going into the connector for the network. So if that happens, what you do is you bend it back. Now, number four, some people would say is not a mistake, but it is my personal preference, and I found it makes life a lot easier building the PC and making sure that one of the most important things, not just for looks, but also for airflow and just maintenance of the system, is to put power supply, the PSU, into the case before you put anything else. Now, obviously, you'll have to do a pretty good idea of where the big cables go from the back of the case to the front. But even if you got that wrong, it doesn't change the concept, because you're not going to connect any of the cables anyway until you get the motherboard in. But let me show you here a power supply that could be used in your case. A lot of very big cables here, running a lot of high powered. I found that if you put this in first, you get to secure these for cable management much more effectively. And that way, when you do the smaller cables, like for the fans and the RGB, they will lie on top of these in the compartment where you're trying to do the cable management in, whether that's in the front or the back, usually in the back. It makes it so much easier to do that. Mistake number five. Now, this is getting into the more important category. Properly seating the CPU chip into the motherboard. There's different problems you can encounter depending on which type of motherboard you have. In particular, there's a major difference between an AMD type motherboard and an Intel. But let me show you a couple of examples here. And this first one is an AMD motherboard, and what I'm showing here, the technique that I'm using by putting my finger down on top of it very lightly, just to make sure that I get a little bit of pressure on it before I lock the CPU chip in place, I found that to be extremely critical, believe me. My current backup editing and gaming rig, that one has a AMD 3700X in it, And when I first built that one, and I put the motherboard together outside the case, so it wasn't like I was having any difficulty working inside the case. I never put on a new build, I never put the actual CPU chip on the motherboard while it's in the case. But when I got it together and started to test it, fortunately I still had everything outside the case at that point. It only saw one of the DIMM sockets. So I started moving it around and troubleshooting and everything else, and I thought I had a bad motherboard. I talk about this in detail in a couple of my other videos. The way I solved it finally, just a hunch, because there's a different support mechanism for supporting the actual CPU chip between an AMD and an Intel. The AMD socket, where the pins are actually on the CPU chip and then being grasped by the socket on the motherboard, that's an older technique that Intel used to do, and Intel originally was using for many years. But they decided to switch to the current technology where the motherboard has the actual pins in it and the CPU just has these little balls of gold-plated metal for each of the pins. But this will definitely lead to a problem if that CPU chip is not pushed down properly when that socket, in particular the AMD one, is closed onto those pins. Number 6. An improper amount of CPU thermal paste. Now that's the thermal paste that goes between the CPU chip and whatever cooler you're using. Doesn't matter whether it's a air cooler or a water-cooled mechanism, a pump that goes on top in that case. It doesn't matter. If you get that wrong, you're going to have a real heating problem with that system. Also, when you get a cooler, a lot of them, in particular the water cooling pumps, come with a little thin piece of plastic covering the platen. That's the part that's on the cooler that contacts with the CPU. You got to make sure you pull that off. And I pull it off and also clean it off with the isopropyl alcohol, 99% that is. Mistake number 7, not getting the front panel connectors right on the motherboard. Now these are the cables that are part of the case. Usually you can't even remove them from the case because at the end that's in the front panel, they're usually soldered in or in a place that you really can't get to. But it's very common for people to get those connectors wrong on the motherboard. They're all together in one bunch. They're kind of hard to get to. They're hard to reach and to see when the motherboard is in the case. If you can actually put them on before you seat the motherboard, that'd be great, but that's not always possible. So you really have to think about this and have good lighting, a really strong flashlight, and make sure you get them right. Now the ones that are LEDs, like the power LED and the hard disk LED, if you get those reversed between polarity, it's not going to hurt anything. The light will not light, but it won't kill the LED. It just won't come on. LEDs don't turn on with reverse voltage. So anyway, if you want to be able to hit the button that first time, because this has happened to me, and have the system come on, make sure that at least the power switch connector is on the right pin. Now for the front panel connectors, here's a set of connectors that are common with most PC cases that you would buy. There's a total of 8 pins. Generally 3 of them are in pairs of 2, and then there's 2 separate ones. That's the most common configuration you'll find it in. They go into a connector on the motherboard. Now in this motherboard, it's this end connector right here. Now there's 9 pins there, but that one that stands alone at the very end, that one is not used, listed on the thing as reserved. As a matter of fact, I'll put the diagram up so you can see it on the screen. And what you have to do is pick these out 2 at a time and put them in their proper place. Now, when it's in the case, it's a lot harder to do than what I have here. So this is just for demonstration purposes. If I want to connect the power switch, it's these 2 pins on this particular one. So I take the power switch, which by the way, does not have any polarity to it. So it says power SW. That goes on these 2 pins right here. And this changes with some cases, so be aware that this may not be the configuration that you see. And then the reset switch is usually right across from it. So these 2 pins right here. So that takes care of 4 of them right there. Now, if your case has a hard drive LED, then that would go into 2 next to the reset switch. Now the polarity does matter for that, and you need to check that diagram. So if I look at this, I see that there's a plus on one side of it. It's very hard to see, but it's right there. There's a plus to the right and a minus to the left. So I've got to orient it just like this and put it in those 2 pins. And then finally, let me turn this around. The ones that are labeled power LED have to go into the next 2, and the polarity does matter. In the same direction with the hard disk indicator, we're going to need, now each one is labeled separately in this case, which is very common. They would go with the negative back over here, the first one to the left, and then the positive right next to that. So now all 8 of them are in. Mistake number 8, Now we're getting into ones where damage can be caused. So be very careful with this. If you have RGB or ARGB, which is the addressable RGB, you've got to make sure you use the right connector on the motherboard. Most modern motherboards today, beyond the very inexpensive ones, they come with connectors for both. So the motherboard can control all of the RGB or ARGB directly from those connectors. And let me now show you an example of what I'm talking about. Now for the RGB, most modern motherboards support both a regular RGB, which is the traditional RGB. It's gone back 2-3 years, to this new ARGB. The ARGB is an addressable RGB, which can provide some fancier tricks with the RGB, but they are completely different. Right here is a 3-pin ARGB, and over here, right next to it, is the 4-pin RGB. They are not interchangeable. Now you could get away with plugging the regular RGB into the ARGB, it just won't work right. Matter of fact, I don't think it'll work at all in most cases. The regular RGB, I have a sample of a fan here. It is regular RGB, and if you look at the connector, it has the 4 pins. So that would go in over here. But also make sure you've oriented it. There's a little arrow there on one pin, and that has to go where this thing says 12 volts. In this case, it's right here, the end one, the far end. So we actually have to turn it over and put the arrow the other way in order for this to plug in here. So that's the proper connection for an RGB. I have here an ARGB fan as well. This one only has 3 pins. Now what they do is they have a little blocker. It's the same connector as the RGB. They put a little block in one of the pins. They also give you an arrow because this uses 5 volts as its source. Now you really can't mess that one up as long as you got the right connector, because 2 pins on one side and 1 pin on the other, it won't really go in any other way. But I've seen people bend one of these pins thinking it was the same thing and plugging this in and burning out. The ARGB will burn out if you plug it into an RGB connector. So be very careful of that. Mistake number 9. Well, most systems today, it's highly recommended and the motherboards tend to support it. You're going to put an NVMe, the non-volatile memory, M.2 form factor, which is what that M.2 refers to, the fact that it's in a little stick like that. They're not that simple to put in, and especially if you decide to do it inside the case, it makes it very, very difficult. Make sure that you place it properly in, and also that you have the little standoff in the right place. I have seen people leave the standoff out. Now the screw threads tend to not work, but that's easy. They go into their bag of screws and they find another one. Now it may work, but in all likelihood, you can actually damage the socket to the M2, and you won't know what happened. And then if you try to reverse it, the motherboard may have already been damaged. If you have a second M2 slot, and they're performed the same, maybe you can get by with that, but imagine you spend a couple of hundred, maybe more, on your particular motherboard, and now you've damaged an M2 slot. That's not good. And then finally, and this one can really cause some damage if you do this wrong, or it may not work. It could go either way. And that's making sure that you're doing the right thing with the BIOS updates. There are some cases where going from like a Gen 2 Ryzen to a Gen 3, most motherboards, they don't come with the latest BIOS that supports that. The same thing going from a Gen 3 to the newer Gen 4 or the 5000 series, right? So you need to do a BIOS update. But there are some other rare cases, and I actually had one of these where it was not recommended. And I'll put up here an example of what was right off of one of the motherboard manufacturers. As you can see there, they recommend not putting in a particular version. That's important to understand, because if you did put the version when you're not supposed to, it may no longer support your CPU. Or worse, there was some sizing issues with certain motherboard manufacturers on certain motherboard products of theirs, and the actual BIOS size wasn't large enough to take the new update. It may stop and cancel the update, but it may not. And that brings me to the final point on that. If you want to do a BIOS update, not a lot of people use UPSs, uninterruptible power supplies. I do. Anything critical to me, I have a UPS on it. If I have a computer that I'm going to update the BIOS, I always do it while it's connected to a working UPS. Because if you allow a power failure to have, whether you've caused it because you accidentally hit the power switch or knocked off the power cord or whatever it is, and that thing loses power in the middle of a BIOS update, it tends to what we call brick the motherboard. That term refers to the fact that, unfortunately, your motherboard is now worth as much as a brick. It's useless to you as a computer part. Those are the 10 mistakes that I wanted to lay out in this video. If people like this, I actually mapped out another 33 mistakes. They're in different categories. Loosely, I'm planning to do another video, sometime in the future, depending on demand and comments to this video, where I'm going to cover 10 more that are more performance oriented, and a couple of security ones thrown in there too. So hopefully you got something out of this video, and if you did, give me a little thumbs up. But more importantly, if you could at least consider subscribing to my channel, that would be extremely helpful. Take care, be safe, and stay healthy.